Hi guys, and welcome to this video on Act 3 from Inspector Calls. And in this part of the act, we see Eric's story. He is returning to the Birlings after the discovery that he is the father of Eva's child, and he's going to give his account of what happened between him and Eva. We'll also see Birling and Mrs. Birling's response to this. Generally, Mr. Birling is concerned about the cash that he stole, and Mrs. Birling is just disgusted by the whole affair. We do see a continuation of the gap that develops between the old and the young, the Birlings and their children. And we see another example of a rich person using money and power to destroy Eva Smith's life. So before we look at the annotation, let's listen to this part of the act.
You all know, don't you?
Yes, we know.
Eric, I can't believe it. There must be some mistake. You don't know what we've been saying.
It's a good job for him he doesn't, isn't it?
Why?
Because Mother's been busy blaming everything on the young man who got this girl into trouble and saying that he shouldn't escape and should be made an example of.
That's enough, Sheila.
You haven't made it any easier for me, have you, Mother?
But I didn't know it was you. I never dreamt. Besides, you're not that type. You don't get drunk.
Of course he does. I told you he did.
Why? You little sneak.
No, that's not fair, Eric. I could have told her months ago, but of course I didn't. I only told her tonight because I knew everything was bound to come out tonight, so I thought she might as well know in advance.
Sheila, I simply don't understand your attitude.
If you had any sense of loyalty...
Oh, but...
Just a minute. There'll be plenty of time when I've gone for you all to adjust your family relationships. But now I must hear what your son has to tell me. When did you first meet this girl?
One night last November.
Where did you meet her?
In the Palace Bar. I'd been there an hour or so with 2 or 3 chaps.
What happened then?
I began talking to her, and stood her a few drinks. I was rather far gone by the time we had to go.
Was she drunk too?
She told me afterwards she was a bit, chiefly because she'd not had much to eat that day.
Why had she gone there?
She wasn't the usual sort, but, well, I suppose she didn't know what to do. There was some woman who wanted her to go there. I never quite understood about that.
You went with her to her lodgings that night?
Yes. I insisted, it seems. I'm not very clear about it, but afterwards she told me she didn't want me to go in, but that I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty, and I threatened to make a row.
So she let you in?
And that's when it happened. And I didn't even remember, and that's the hellish thing.
Oh, Eric! How could you?
Sheila, take your mother along to the drawing room.
But I want...
Now, you heard what I said. Now, go on, Sybil.
Come on, Mother.
When did you meet her again?
About a fortnight afterwards.
By appointment?
No. And I couldn't remember her name or where she lived. It was all very vague. But I happened to see her again in the Palace Bar.
And you took her home again?
Yes. And this time we talked a bit. She told me something about herself, and I talked too. Told her my name and what I did.
And you made love again?
I wasn't in love with her or anything, but... well, I liked her. She was pretty and a good sport.
Well, so you had to go to bed with her.
I'm old enough to be married, aren't I? And I'm not married. And I hate these fat old tarts around the town, the ones I see some of your respectable friends with.
I don't want any of that.
I don't want any of it from either of you. Settle it afterwards. Did you arrange to see each other after that?
Yes. And the next time, or the time after, she told me she thought she was going to have a baby.
And of course she was very worried about it.
Yes, and so was I. I was in a hell of a state about it.
Did she suggest you ought to marry her?
Oh, she didn't want me to marry her. I said I didn't love her and all that. In a way, she treated me as if I were a kid, though I was nearly as old as she was.
So what did you propose to do?
Well, she hadn't a job and didn't feel like trying again for one, and she'd no money left, so I insisted on giving her enough money to keep her going, until she refused to take any more.
How much did you give her altogether?
I suppose about £50, all told.
£50? Where did you get £50 from?
That's my question, too.
I got it from the office.
My office?
Yes.
You mean you stole the money?
Not really.
Well, what do you mean, not really?
I'm
isn't
sorry,
my
Arthur,
fault.
but I simply couldn't stay in there. I had to know what's happening.
Well, I can tell you what's happening. He's admitted he was responsible for the girl's condition, and now he's telling us he supplied her with money he stole from the office.
You stole money?
No, not really. I intended to pay it back.
Oh, we've heard that story before. How could you have paid it back?
I'd have managed somehow. I had to have some money.
Damned fool! Why didn't you come to me when you found yourself in this mess?
Because you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. That's why.
Don't you talk to me like that. Your trouble is you've been spoilt.
And my trouble is that I haven't much time. You'll be able to divide the responsibility between you when I've gone. Just one last question, that's all. The girl discovered that this money you were giving her was stolen, didn't she?
Yes. That was the worst of all. She wouldn't take any more, and she said she didn't want to see me again. Here, but how do you know that? Did she tell you?
No, she told me nothing. I never spoke to her.
She told Mother.
Sheila!
She told you. Did she come here? Then she couldn't have done. She didn't even know I lived here. What happened? Come on, Mother, don't just look at me like that. Tell me. Tell me what happened.
I'll tell you. She went to your mother's committee for help after she'd done with you. Your mother refused that help.
Then you killed her. She came to you to protect me, and you turned her away, yes? And you killed her.
Eric.
And the child she'd have had too, my child. Your own grandchild. You killed them both. Damn you. Damn you!
Eric, please, I didn't know. I didn't understand.
You don't understand anything, do you? You never did. You never even tried to.
Oh, you hysterical young fool! Get back!
Stop! And listen to me. I don't need to know any more. Neither do you. This girl killed herself and died a horrible death. But each of you helped to kill her. Remember that. Never forget it. But then, I don't think you ever will. Remember what you did, Mrs. Birling. You turned her away when she most needed help. You refused her even the pitiable little bit of organised charity you had in your power to grant her. Remember what you did.
My God. I'm not likely to forget.
Just used her for the end of a stupid, drunken evening, as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person. You, Miss Birling.
I know. I had her turned out of a job. I started it.
You helped, but didn't start it. Your father started it. She wanted 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and sixpence. You made her pay a heavy price for that. And now she'll make you pay a heavier price still.
Look, Inspector, I'd give thousands. Yes, thousands.
See, you're offering the money at the wrong time, Mr. Birling. No. I don't think any of you will forget. Nor that young man, Croft, though he at least had some affection for her and made her happy for a time. Well, Eva Smith's gone. You can't do her any more harm. And you can't do her any good now, either. You can't even say, "I'm sorry, Eva Smith."
That's the worst of it.
But just remember this. One Eva Smith has gone. But there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives, with what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other, and I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night.
Okay, So let's look at some annotation. So just as the other acts pick up from the action at the end of the previous acts, this one does the same, and it picks up from the action at the end of Act 2. So Eric comes back just at the end of Act 2, and Act 3 begins with Eric stood in the doorway. Now, with this, consider his positioning. In this, he mirrors the inspector in Act 1. Do you remember I talked about the inspector in Act 1 blocking the exit for the Birlings? Well, now the person blocking the exit is Eric. This, I think, shows that through Eric's involvement with Eva Smith, the rest of the Birling's involvement becomes a lot more fixed with what actually happened to Eva Smith. Now that it is Eric and it's Eric's child that has died, the Birlings really cannot escape from the fact that they are responsible for Eva Smith's death. Also consider that the inspector was blocking the doorway in judgment of the Birlings. We, within this part of the act, are going to see Eric judging the Birlings as well. So, he kind of mirrors the role of the inspector in that way. And as well, before we start looking at this act, we need to consider illegitimate children. The child that Eva Smith would have had with Eric would have definitely been illegitimate. And at this time, they would have been seen as social outsiders. The idea that anybody born out of wedlock was somehow morally wrong. Again, showing the moral values of the times. But also, with regards to illegitimate children, we must consider women's rights and who is actually responsible for caring for that child once it is born. Okay, so firstly, we see Mrs. Birling continually denying the fact that Eric was involved. She says, I can't believe it. She says, there must be some mistake and you don't know what we've been saying. I think this is a point about responsibility. Because Mrs. Birling has found it impossible to accept responsibility for any involvement, she sees it as impossible for Eric to have any responsibility for the issues that happened with Eva Smith. We then get some irony from Sheila, who tells Eric that her mother's been blaming everything on the young man who got this girl into trouble and saying he shouldn't escape and should be made an example of. Now, remembering back to the end of Act 2, this is ironic because before Mrs. Birling actually knows that it's Eric, she's saying throw the book at him. This backs up Mrs. Birling's social expectation of an illegitimate child's parent. The idea that any man that would get a woman pregnant out of wedlock should be made an example of. Mrs. Birling continues that denial by saying, but I didn't know it was you, kind of giving this indication that it's okay for a member of her family to act in one way and that she's willing to overlook her moral values because it is a member of her own family. Mrs. Birling, again, this is kind of dramatic irony. She says, you don't get drunk. And he's always drunk. He's been drunk throughout the entirety of this play. We see a little remnant of Eric and Sheila's relationship from the beginning of the play, when Eric calls Sheila a little sneak for telling Mrs. Birling that she drinks, but Sheila instantly shuts this down. She says, no, that's not fair, Eric. I could have told her months ago, and so on. Sheila indicates that this is a night of truths, saying it was simply bound to come out tonight, showing him that everything has now changed. Their relationship has changed, their understanding of the world has changed, they've become a lot more mature and a lot more understanding. We see some difference between Mrs. Birling and Sheila, when Mrs. Birling says, Sheila, I simply don't understand your attitude. This is the old versus the young. This is the idea that Mrs. Birling represents that life of 1912, whereas Sheila represents that life of 1945, when everybody had a much broader social conscience. Birling backs that up. He says, if you had any sense of loyalty, meaning to family, the idea that if they were loyal to their family, then they wouldn't want any of this change and they'd be backing them up. The inspector then cuts in, showing that he recognises that this change has happened. He says, he indicates that when he's gone, there'll be time for them to adjust your family relationships, to work out what is going to happen now that this rift has grown between Sheila and Eric and Birling and Mrs. Birling. We then move on to Eric's story. Eric asks for a drink, which is very typical for his character. Now, there's a really nice contrast here between the character of Birling and the inspector if you look at the adverbs that are used for their characters. Birling, to the question, can Eric have a drink? Explosively, no. Whereas the inspector, he says firmly, yes. Again, this shows the inspector is the opposite of Birling. He believes that it's okay for Eric to have a drink now because he needs that to see him through. He understands this news is going to be rough. Do look at those two adverbs though. So Birling explosively, showing that he has no control over the situation. He's just trying to lash out and intimidate people away, but it's not working. Whereas the inspector, firmly, this shows the inspector is in control of the situation. Eric, interestingly, has the adverb bitterly. Now let's just think a little bit about what might Eric be bitter about. Is it his overall family? that he dislikes them now? Is it to do with the inspector? He doesn't want this coming out. Or is it to do with Eva? Is he bitter about what happened with their relationship? Is he bitter about the fact, that his child, is dead? He says, I understand a lot of things now I didn't understand before. This shows the change within Eric. Is this the beginnings of his social responsibility? Is he starting to understand that his actions do impact on the world around him? However, the inspector is done and he just wants to get to the end of it now. He says, I want to get on. Then Eric relays the details of his meeting with Eva. They met at the Palace Bar, the same place that she met Gerald. The inspector asks if she was drunk, to indicate was she vulnerable. Eric says that she was, but she was hungry because she'd not had much to eat that day, indicating the level of poverty that Eva Smith is currently going through. Eric makes a comment about her as a prostitute. He says she wasn't the usual sort. This is kind of the same thing that Gerald saw within her. He says that she wasn't like these dough-faced women, like the typical prostitute. So again, that's what gets Eric interested. This is just a little note about the prostitution. He says there was some woman who wanted her to go there. This would be a madam, kind of an old-style pimp, someone that would prostitute a woman out. Now we see something truly dark about Eric's character. When going back to her lodgings, Eric says, yes, I insisted. He says that she told me she didn't want me to go in, indicating that Eva did not give him consent to go into her property. However, Eric says, I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty and I threatened to make a row. Eric takes advantage and threatens his way into Eva. He uses physical threats, he uses verbal threats, he uses the threat of unveiling her profession to her neighbours in the street to get into her house. And then Eric says, and that's when it happened. The fact that he uses the term it for it. This wasn't a pleasurable activity. This wasn't love or just fun. We have to ask ourselves the question: did Eric rape Eva Smith? And it looks very much like Eric did rape Eva Smith. He describes it as hellish because he doesn't even remember it. Truly awful. And in this case, Eric is just using the fact that he is a man to get to Eva Smith. Like Mrs. Birling shows how she understands how serious it is. So Eric, how could you? And then Birling asks Sheila to take Mrs. Birling into the drawing room, and Sheila protests. Just finally think about that image of Birling sending the two women out so they don't have to hear these horrible things. That calls back to Act 1 when Birling asks the inspector why is he upsetting the girl, and that he thinks that girls shouldn't be subjected to upsetting things. It's the role of men and the power that men have over women. So then Eric relays going to see Eva Smith again. He says he couldn't remember her name or where she lived. Does this show that he was drunk, or does this show her value to him? She was someone to use at the end of a night and, kind of discard. He talks about meeting her again and says that yes, though that time it wasn't so bad. Now note, he returns to the victim and he has no shame. However, despite everything that happened, the inspector asks, but you took her home again? Eric says yes. Now why would Eva go home with him? Why would she go with him again? The fact that she was a prostitute, an abuse victim, the fact that she had no support, all of these things linked together to put Eva in a really, really dangerous, really, really worrying situation. Eric says that he wasn't in love with her, but he liked her. Birling harshly interjects, saying so you had to go to bed with her. He passes a moral judgment on Eric and Eva's relationship here. Now just consider the hypocrisy with this. It's already been indicated that one of Birling's associates has kind of been doing exactly the same thing, that old Megati. And I think because Eric is young here, Birling judges him extra harshly. Because Eric is beneath him within the patriarchy, Birling is more open to, pointing the finger at him and telling him what you're doing is wrong. And Eric throws that back in his face. He says, I'm not married and I hate these fat old tarts round the town, the ones I see some of your respectable friends with. Eric points out that hypocrisy, that idea that Birling is quite happy to punish Eric, but then, forgive his friends for doing exactly the same thing. Eric then reveals that Eva told him she was going to have a baby, and he says, I was in a hell of a state about it. Somewhat showing that he was concerned with himself. He wasn't that worried about her, he was most worried about how he was feeling. Marriage is then brought up, linking with that social expectation that if a man gets a woman pregnant, then they really should get married. Eric says that she didn't want to marry him. And he complains that Eva treated him as if he were a kid, though I was nearly as old as she was. This study that he has a lack of life experience. You think about all the different things that Eva Smith has gone through up to this point. Losing jobs, moving houses, ending relationships, losing parents, all of that kind of stuff. Eric has lived this really, really sheltered life where everything that he's ever wanted he's had, and everything that he's ever needed has been provided. He lacks so much experience compared to her, and she recognises that really he is just a child. Then, in continuing to discuss their relationship, we must note the use of broken speech, indicating that it is difficult for Eric to talk about this sort of stuff. He then talks about money, indicating that he gave her money to try and support her. Now, this shows Eric being just like Gerald. He believes that he can buy this woman's happiness, that he can give her money, and in some way feel that what he's doing is right, even though he's put her in a really, really terrible position, raping her, and then getting her pregnant, and it's really, really messy, and I don't think money was what she needed. We then get to the point where Eric is confessing the fact that he stole that money from the office, and this really causes a lot of conflict between him and Birling. Birling angrily pointing out, what do you mean, not really? Showing that he's more concerned with Eric stealing than he is with Eric getting this woman pregnant. He's reacting much more negatively to this. And then look at the next adverb used with Birling's speech, savagely. This is him now tearing a chunk off of Eric for stealing money. He says he's admitted he was responsible for the girl's condition, and now he's telling us he supplied her with money he stole from the office. He's showing that main concern, linking with the idea of Birling being a capitalist and a hard-headed man of business and all that kind of stuff. Backing this up again, Birling asks, I don't understand how you could take as much as that out of the office without somebody knowing. Again, his capitalist values. Again, Birling's biggest concern being protecting business. He says, I've got to cover this up as soon as I can, about Eric taking money from contractors and things like that and using them for his own ends. This is Birling's biggest concern. He asks Eric, why didn't you come to me when you found yourself in this mess? And Eric replies, because you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble, that's why. And I think that is Eric being really honest with Birling for the first time in his life. You're telling him exactly how he feels, telling him exactly what the situation is. And all of that links to the idea that Eric doesn't feel supported by Birling. He doesn't feel cared for, he doesn't feel trusted. Birling angrily, after that's been said, kind of refusing to change in a way, saying, don't talk to me like that, your trouble is you've been spoiled. Now, this is Birling seeing financial care, not emotional care, as the most important thing in somebody's life. If you pay for the things that they need, if you give them what they want, then they should just love you. Rather than if you care for them and you nurture them and you treat them with respect. The inspector cuts in with this and says, my trouble is that I haven't much time. You'll be able to divide the responsibility between you. Again, so he's mirroring Birling's speech here to take control of the situation, just as he's done throughout the play. And that responsibility that the inspector is talking about, is that the responsibility for Eva's death? Is that familial responsibility? Where do people stand within the hierarchy of their family anymore? Or is that social responsibility? The fact that Eric and Sheila are hopefully going to go on to be much more socially responsible and try to do things that improve the world. So Eric says that Eva Smith wouldn't take any more of the money. This is the same morality that we have seen in Mrs. Birling's story, when she talks about how that she was assuming high morals and things like that, in not wanting to take the money. But then Eric asks the inspector, how did you know that? And it's because Mrs. Birling told him. And this once more shows Sheila on the side now of truth and responsibility. She wants to be open and she wants to let Eric know all of the situations. This causes Eric a great deal of distress because he now sees that Mrs. Birling and Eva Smith are somehow linked. And he says, tell me what happened. These imperatives showing a change in their relationship, Eric now being the one to boss his parents about. She won't talk, so the inspector tells him everything that happened. He's very matter of fact in this, in the way that he has been throughout the play, mirroring the speech patterns of an actual inspector. And in response to this, Eric says, then you killed her, showing that he feels the responsibility for Eva's death lies at the feet of Mrs. Birling. He repeats this, you killed her, and then, that's a really good thing to remember if the character of Eric comes up or the character of Mrs. Birling comes up. This accusation, you killed her, a lot can be said about that. And he further develops this by saying you killed your own grandchild. Now, this is a little bit of implied hypocrisy. Mrs. Birling is all for family values, yet in this instance, she's been responsible for the death of her own grandchild. Mrs. Birling, very distressed, replies, no, Eric, please, I didn't know, I didn't understand. This shows her a little bit broken, and this is the first time in the play that we see her really show any kind of true emotion. However, Eric replies, you don't understand anything, showing that he sees that she feels no responsibility for Eva's death, and that she feels no social responsibility for people within the same class as Eva Smith. Birling breaks in furiously, intervening, why, you hysterical young fool, showing, again, no care for Eric, and the inspector takes charge masterfully. Good adverb. Stop, he says. They are quiet and they all look at him. He indicates, each of you helped to kill her. And this is the idea that they are all responsible. And I'd like to take a moment just to go through the play at this point and answer that. How are they all involved? Just recap that. And really in doing this, the inspector is going to go through how they are all involved, and we'll see him go to each character and just do a small recap now. So he starts with Mrs. Birling. He begins at the end. He says to her, you refused her even the pitiable little bit of organised charity you had in your power to grant her. This is the idea that she neglected her social responsibility, that Mrs. Birling uses her charity as a kind of status symbol. She doesn't see it as a way of improving the lives of the poor. She sees it as a way of lording it over other people and making her feel better about her life. He then turns to Eric and says that he just used her for the end of a stupid drunken evening as if she were an animal, a thing, not a person. The idea that Eric objectified her, and that Eric used her and didn't care. He wanted something and he took it. Sheila accepts her share of responsibility. She says, I started it. The inspector replies, you helped but didn't start it. He turns to Birling, saying, she wanted 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and sixpence. You made her pay a heavy price for that. And, this metaphor showing that she lost her life for the money that she wanted. And now she'll make you pay a heavier price still, in the form of the guilt that he will feel for the rest of his life for the death of Eva Smith. For the breakdown of his family, the fact that Eric and Sheila are kind of gone and they're never going to be a unit again. It could even be the loss of his status that will come with the scandal around this story. This kind of is the consequences of his actions coming back to bite him here. And Birling replies, look, Inspector, I give thousands, yes, thousands, once more showing that Birling feels that money is the solution to all problems, once more showing that Birling really hasn't changed. And the inspector says, you're offering the money at the wrong time, showing that some things in life cannot be fixed with money. Now the inspector starts to conclude. He's about to leave, and we see two key speeches from the inspector at the end of this part of the act. He says to them all, you can't do her any more harm, and you can't do her any good now either. You can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith. Now, the rhetorical device they're being used, we've got a rule of three, or a tricolon you may call it. You can't, you can't, you can't. This emphasises the responsibility that the Birlings all had towards Eva Smith, that they have now lost, because she is dead. It also goes to emphasise the consequences of their actions, the fact that they cannot make things right with this one person because she is now dead. However, the inspector then flips that on its head and says, but just remember this, one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. This talks about the anonymous poor. That just because one person who lives in poverty is gone doesn't mean you can't make a difference to the millions of people who are also living in poverty. And that millions and millions and millions, that shows the scale of poverty at this time, and shows that the inspector really understands that there are millions and millions and millions of people living in absolute poverty. And note, Similarly, with the name Eva Smith, Eva being a really common name at the time, John, once more, being a really common name of the time. He says, their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives, showing that we all have a social responsibility towards these people. That on a daily basis, our lives will be touched by people that are living in poverty, and in some way we should try to help touch their lives too. He says, we don't live alone. And this is kind of socialism in action now. This really is Priestley putting out all of his beliefs and values within this character of the inspector. He says, we don't live alone. We live in a society. We are members of one body. The idea that if everyone is functioning to help everyone in society, then we are more efficient. We are a better community. He says we are responsible for each other, and I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. Now, this time when they'll be taught in fire and blood and anguish, and remember that quotation, it's a really, really easy one to remember for the inspector, and there's so much you can talk about with that. This references World War One. He's saying here that if we don't abandon the ideas around nationalism and division, the idea that one group is better than other groups, and that we shouldn't be helping each other, and that we shouldn't be moving into the world to try and make the world a better place. If we don't learn that, then that will lead to World War One. And this is kind of a final piece of dramatic irony linked with the history of this play, because remember, this was in 1945. The audience watching this will remember that society did not learn those lessons, and that World War One happened, and that millions and millions of men died. And with that, the inspector is gone, leaving the family crying, collapsing chairs, brooding desperately. This shows the family kind of shattered. Okay, so that's that video then. It's a fairly gloomy end. I hope you found that useful, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye bye.